In this video, we will walk through Tableau's order of operations. If you search for order of operations in Tableau's documentation, this is the diagram that you will find. On the left-hand side, you're going to see different kinds of filters, and then on the right-hand side, we are going to see different kinds of calculations and operations, like top-N, fixed LODs, table calculations, even reference lines. The topic of order of operations often come up when we talk about calculations. This is because oftentimes we combine filters and calculations, and our choice of filters can affect the results that we get from these operations. There are two main parts to this video. First, we're going to step through this diagram and show exactly where to find the different kinds of filters in Tableau Desktop. In the second part, we will see a few common examples which will illustrate why knowing the order of operations matter. Otherwise, we may get unexpected results. Before we demonstrate where the filters are, let's understand what this diagram means first. This diagram depicts a hierarchy. As I've mentioned earlier, on the left-hand side, we see different kinds of filters, and on the right-hand side, we see different kinds of calculations and operations. The order in which they appear in this diagram indicate what kinds of filters affect what kind of operations and calculations. The ones at the top will affect everything below it. For example, if we apply an extract filter, which is at the very top of this diagram, it means that the portion of data that we filter out technically disappears downwards. It's no longer available in the later stages and operations. On the reverse side, if we try to filter something using a table calculation filter, that filter doesn't really affect our extract filters because it's way down in this hierarchy. One analogy I can think of is when we sift through something. This could be grains or sand or coffee. The granules that are removed by the sieve will never be seen downwards in that process. The result at the very bottom also depends on how many sieves we apply or how many layers of filters we apply. Also, another thing to note is that some of these filters apply at the workbook level, for example, extract filters and data source filters. And some of these filters affect the worksheet level, meaning different kinds of worksheets can have different kinds of filters applied to them and they may get different results. And on the right-hand side, these are all the operations. And in here, it's important to note exactly where these operations are with respect to the filters. For example, let's say fixed LOD. If we extrapolate this line, it means the fixed LODs are going to be affected by filters above it, but it's not going to be affected by filters below it. Order of operations is not a new concept. It's not a Tableau-specific concept. This concept is deeply rooted in math. This fundamental concept identifies the sequence in which mathematical operations are performed. And this is critical because we can get incorrect results when we think something works one way, but in fact it doesn't because of the precedence or the order of operations. And in math and programming, we know for sure that parentheses, they take precedence. So now let's move on to the demonstration portion. Let's take a look at where different types of filters are in Tableau. Let's start with the extract filters. Where are they? So here in Tableau, in our data source pane, on the right-hand side, once you connect to your data source, you're going to find two options. One is live and one is extract. We can add an extract filter from here. So for example, if I choose extract from this place, as soon as I select it, I'm going to see another option called edit. When we click on edit, we get to this window, and this has a section specific to filters. So if we wanted to add additional filters, we can simply click on add. And for example, if I wanted to limit the categories that are used by this particular workbook, I can add the category filter and here select, for example, just furniture. Once we click OK and we go to a worksheet, in here, the only category we'll ever see is furniture. It's as if the other two categories don't exist at all for this particular data source in this workbook. We can adjust the extract filter from a sheet view as well. You don't have to be in the data source window. So if you right-click on your data source, select extract data, in here we have access to that same filter section. Now let's move on to the data source filters. We are back in Tableau, and in the data source view, in here, we're going to see on the top right corner, right beside the connection options, we are going to see filters, and this is your data source filter. So from here, we can add a filter. When we click on add, it gives us a window for data source filters. In this case, let's add a category filter, very similar to what we've done with the extract. Select furniture, click OK, and OK again. Now, when we go to a worksheet view, let's drag category over. The effect is very similar to your extract. The only difference is the extract filter is very specific to an extract, which is a proprietary data source from Tableau. The live could be coming from other data sources. In this case, I'm connecting to an Excel file. But anything that I have filtered out, the other two types of categories will not flow through. So this particular data source in this workbook will not see those other two categories. Let's tackle the next three filters together because they're really related. In here, I have a new connection. There's no filters in here, no extract filters, no data source filters. So this is just a complete Superstore dataset. A dimension filter is essentially just a filter on dimension. So let's start by creating a chart. So for example, we have subcategory onto rows, and let's say sales onto columns. A dimension filter is a filter on a dimension. So for example, in here, I can add a filter on subcategory. I can click on the drop down, show filter, and this is my dimension filter. I can add another dimension filter if we need to. So for example, category all the way to filters, and in here we can select all. That's our dimension filter. Our measure filter is a filter on the measure. In here, we already have a measure. So for example, if we wanted to filter by the total sales, we can simply click on this pill, on the drop down, let's show the filter, and this is our measure filter. So again, we have dimension filters and measure filters. Now, where is this context filter? What does that mean? A context filter is a filter on a dimension. So it can only exist in a dimension. We're going to show that shortly. But the context filter allows interdependency between the filters. Right now I have two filters, and the way it's going to work is using what we call an AND clause. Both of these conditions together have to be true, and they're technically evaluated at the same time. However, if we wanted to have a little bit of hierarchy, for example, if we wanted the category filter to happen first and have the other filters depend on the results of that category filter, then we're going to add our context filter. So let's just take a look again. We said context filters only appear in dimensions. So right now in subcategory, when I click on that drop down on that filter, we're going to see an option for add to context. It's going to be true for category. In here, we're also going to see add to context. However, our measure will not have that option. So context filters are only for dimensions. Now also pay attention when I add categories as a context filter, what's going to happen is first, the color is going to change. Second, the order is also going to change. So category will turn to gray and it's going to move up. So on the drop down, add to context. Again, category now is gray and it has moved up. And this is an indication that the other two filters work on the results of the first filter. We're going to see the relevance of this later on when we go through our examples. The final type of filter in here is our table calc filter. So let's go back to Tableau. And in here, let's create a brand new worksheet. And let's just create a chart that has some kind of table calculation. So for example, I'm going to right-click order date. Let's choose continuous month, which is 4th from the bottom. Let's click OK. Let's duplicate this. I'm going to control drag sum of profit to copy that pill. If you're using a Mac, it's going to be a command drag to copy the pill. On the second pill, let's add a quick table calculation and let's just use percent difference. So in this particular case, if we wanted to filter the results based on the table calculation, then what we need to do is to have the table calculation on the filter. And the easiest way to do that, if you already have that pill in the canvas, is to simply copy that pill onto your filter shelf. So in this case, again, I'm using a PC, so I'm using control drag. If you're using a Mac, it's going to be a command drag. So control drag onto filters. And this is now your table calc filter. So anything that has a table calculation, visually you're going to see the table calculations with this delta symbol or the triangle symbol. This is an example of how you would add a table calc filter. So any field that has a table calculation that is placed onto your filter shelf. So now that we know where these filters are or how to add them, let's go through some examples. For the first example, let's say we want to take a look at a top list. And this top list can be an overall top list or maybe a top list based on certain criteria. So we might want to add a filter in here and have a top 10 based on our selection in our filters. So in this particular example, we're going to see how dimension and context filters are different. And again, this interdependency of dimension filters to context filters will matter. Okay, so we're back in Tableau. Let's assume we want a list of top products by sales. We can drag our product name and our sales onto columns, and we can sort this. Let's also display the category. So right now we can see that the top 10 is actually a combination of technology products, office supplies, and furnitures. And it looks like there's only a single furniture in our overall top 10. Now with our dimension filters, we can add a top or bottom filter. So here in our product name, if we click on the drop down under filter, here we see a top tab. When we go here, maybe we want to get just a top 10 products by sales. So we're going to toggle this. Instead of none, we're going to select by field, and we're going to keep this as top 10 by sales. Let's click OK. And again, right now, we can see that our overall top 10 is a mix of different categories. But what if our requirements change? What if we wanted to know the top 10 technology, or the top 10 furniture, or the top 10 office supplies? In here, we might be inclined to just add another dimension filter. So on the drop-down, we can show our category filter. And if, for example, we decide just furniture products, here what we have could be an unexpected result. Why are we only getting one value when we ask for top 10? And the reason for this is, again, these two dimension filters, they work concurrently. What it does is it gets the top 10. So in here you have a top 10 products. And from within here, it's only taking out our furniture. And the intersection of these two is just a single thing. What we really want to do is to filter by furniture first. And from all of that furniture, get the top 10. And this is where context filters will come in, because context filters is higher in the hierarchy. We can make it filter by furniture first, and now the dimension filter can just work as is. It's going to get the top 10 of whatever data that flows through it. So in this particular example, what we need to do is to make the category filter a context filter. So again, on the drop-down of that dimension filter, we're going to add to context. And now what happens is the dimension filter works as is. It just gets the top 10 of whatever data that flows through it. But it just so happens that right now, the only data that flows through it is furniture. Let's test furniture and technology. So now we can kind of see the combination. Maybe it's just technology. Maybe it's just office supplies, or still the overall. The second example is another very common scenario. This is where we might need to use a percent of total. We know percent of total is readily available with table calculations, but in this example, we're going to compare and contrast the behavior of table calculations and LODs, or level of detail expressions, and we're going to see how two different types of filters can affect each of them. So let's start by creating a very simple table. In here, I'm simply going to use category, and I'm going to add sales to text. Let's also add our totals. So in the sidebar Analytics tab, we can double click on totals. If we wanted to add a percent of total, one possible easy way is using a table calculation, but we just need to know the behavior of a table calculation. So for now, let's add our percent of total first. On the drop-down of our measure, quick table calculation, this is going to be percent of total. And let's re-add back our original sales value. So double click on sales, and then just move these around. So I'm going to put the percent of total to the right. Now let's also add category as a dimension filter. So on the drop-down of category, show filter. So what's important to note in here is that our table calculations are going to be affected by our dimension filters. Our table calcs are actually almost at the very bottom. It's right here. If we extrapolate this line, we can see that pretty much every other filter will affect its results. Anything above this line affects it. Anything below the line does not affect it. Dimension filters and measure filters are above our table calcs, which means it's going to affect the data that it can work on. So for example, right now, we have three values, 32%, 31%, 36%. But guess what happens when we filter some of the values out? It means that the table calculation cannot see those data points anymore. Therefore, it cannot account for those in the calculation. So if we uncheck technology, all of a sudden our 30% values become a 50 and a 49%. So there are use cases where this is probably the behavior that you're looking for, but there are also other use cases where you want to keep the actual total. And this is where level of detail expressions come in. If you need a refresher on level of detail expressions, I also have a tutorial on LODs. It's a full-blown tutorial including fixed, include, and exclude. For this particular example, we're only going to focus on fixed LODs. So let's create a new calculated field. It's going to be a fixed LOD on grand total. So let's call this grand total fixed LOD. And this one is simply just going to be the sum of sales. So let's display this first. Double click. Now we have this fixed grand total, 2.3 million, which is exactly the same as what we're seeing in the grand total right now. But let's take a look at what happens when we filter some of the values out. Let's say we uncheck technology. Our fixed LOD remains at 2.3 million. However, our view total now drops down to 1.4 million. So why is this? The main reason for this is our fixed LOD is actually higher in the hierarchy. If we extrapolate this line, the fixed LODs are affected by extract filters, data source filters, and context filters, but it doesn't see the dimension filters. The dimension filters don't affect it. So dimension filters, measure filters, and table calc filters, they don't affect our fixed LODs. So going back to our example, if we wanted to retain the original percent of totals, what we could do is create a calculation that is based on this fixed grand total. So on the dropdown, create calculated field. Let's call this percent of total. And this is simply going to be our sum of sales divided by our grand total, the one that is based on the fixed LOD. Let's click on OK. And then here, change the default property, number format. It's going to be a percentage, and click OK. And let's display this. Let's add all the categories again. Right now, everything's the same. Where it's going to become different is when we start filtering some of the values out. So if we uncheck technology, the calculations based on the fixed LOD, they're not affected by this dimension filter. However, our table calculations, remember, table calculations exist almost at the very end of that hierarchy. They're going to be affected by our dimension filters. If, however, we decide to add our category as a context filter, and our context filters, they are above our fixed LODs. So it's going to affect the fixed LOD. Let's add all the categories back again first. If we add category to context filter, it means it's going to affect the fixed LOD. So on the dropdown, add to context. And if we uncheck technology now, at this point, the behavior of the LOD and the table calc will be the same. So again, in here, the important thing to remember is that the behavior is different. The initial numbers may be the same, but we have to be aware of how these calculations are going to be affected by different types of filters, especially if we have them in our dashboards. For our third example, we will illustrate why it's tricky to try and filter something that has a table calculation. Here we're going to use a running total table calculation, and we're going to see how a regular dimension filter affects it and why a table calculation filter would be a right choice. This also tackles a very common issue, a very common trick that we need to do when we're filtering based on results of table calculations. Let's start by creating a time series chart. So right-click, drag order date onto columns, choose continuous month, which is fourth from the bottom, click OK, and let's display sales. Just for demonstration, we're going to change the mark to a bar, and we're going to copy this pill. So control-click drag or command-click drag to copy that pill. If you're using a Mac, it's going to be a command drag. And for the second pill, we're going to add a running total table calculation. So on the drop-down, quick table calculation, running total. So let's pick an example here. As of January 21, the running total value is 512,000. So we're going to mark that right here. And this value actually takes into account all of the months since the beginning of this data set, which is January 2020. What if in this particular view, we only want to see the months in 2021? The natural instinct is to actually just add a dimension filter, something like this. So you might decide to drag order date onto filters and decide to display only the year 2021. There is a challenge in here, and that challenge is the dimension filter will affect our table calculation filter. So right now, as of January 2021, because it doesn't see the previous 12 months, it is reporting a running total of just 18,000, which is incorrect because we are expecting 512,000. So again, our table calculation is right here. Our dimension filter is above it. So if we add a dimension filter, The table calculation will not see those data points that we filtered out. If we wanted to keep the table calculation results but simply hide or show certain portions of that data set, what we could do is rely on a table calculation filter. From a hierarchy perspective, it sits below our table calculations, so it shouldn't affect our table calculation numbers. So how are we going to do this? We want to add a filter by year, but we don't want the year to affect our table calculations. We do have a table calculation function that we can use. There is this function called lookup that accepts an aggregate expression and then some kind of an offset. We can pass dimensions or measures in this particular function. So in this case, we simply just need to enclose our year value in the lookup function. And then now Tableau is going to consider this as a table calculation. So let's just test first how this is going to work. Let's duplicate our current chart into a crosstab. So right click, duplicate as crosstab. And in our new sheet, let's take a look at the tabular value. Let's just move the fields around so it's a little bit easier to see. In your toolbar, you can swap your rows and your columns. So what we need to do is to create a field encapsulated in a table calculation that still gives us our years. So 2020, 2021, and so forth. We know we simply cannot use the dimension value. So in here, this is our dimension. I'm just going to copy this over so we can see what happens. Right now, we have the year 2021. And again, at this point, we have the incorrect running total. If we display this as a filter, we're going to see all the years. So now let's create a calculated field that mimics these values, but is encapsulated in a table calculation using our lookup function. So on the dropdown, create calculated field. Let's call this year. I'm just going to add TC so that we know it's table calculation. And we're simply just going to use that same value. So let's add lookup. The lookup function will accept an aggregated expression, meaning it has to be inside a min, a max, a count, so some kind of an aggregated function. In this case, we simply cannot use this expression, which is our year. Right now, if we want to keep it apples to apples, it is going to be the date part function that determines that year. Here, this needs to be an aggregation. We also need to provide what's called an offset. So in here, we're going to provide an offset of 0, meaning return the current value. With the lookup function, we can pass a positive value, which means it's going to look forward, or we can pass a negative value, which means it's going to look backwards. So in this case, we're going to look up just the current value. At this point though, we still have an error because we still haven't encapsulated this date part in an aggregate function yet. So let's use, for example, minimum. Right now, the calculation is valid, but what is this expression really doing? What this is saying is for each individual line, what is the minimum year? For January 2021, there's actually really just a single year. So the minimum year is still going to be 2021. We're also saying don't go anywhere, just look up the current value. So we don't need to look forward, we don't need to look backwards. So in essence, we're just displaying the year. The only difference is this year now gets calculated and applied after our running total calculations are done. So it's not going to affect it anymore. So let's click OK right now. This is going to show up in our measures area. Let's just change this to discrete. And let's add this to our filters. Let's just change the format as well so there's no commas. Right click, default properties, number format, and in here under number, we're not going to include the 1000 separator and 0 decimal places. And let's display this filter as well. So on the drop down, show filter. So let's add back all the years. The bottom filter is our regular dimension filter. The top filter is our table calculation filter. And the big difference is if we are using our dimension filter, again, let's choose just 2021. What happens is our running total number is incorrect because it doesn't take into account all the past 12 months values from 2020. However, if we do the table calculation filter in here, let's uncheck that and use 2021. Right now, it may seem incorrect, but it's just we need to check the direction of our calculation. So in our table calculation on the dropdown, compute using, and in here we just want to apply table down because the numbers are only going one way. Compute using, table down. Look at our results. It's 512,000. And this is our expected value. This is the value that we want to retain. So going back to our original worksheet, we're going to remove our original year dimension filter. We're going to replace this with our table calculation filter. Let's show this filter. And if we wanted to keep just 2021, first value as of January 2021, it has retained the correct running total result, 512,000. And that is it. Just to recap, we described order of operations in this video. There are two main parts. In the first portion, we demonstrated where different types of filters can be found in Tableau Desktop. And in the second portion, we went through some examples that illustrate where different types of filters will matter and how they're going to affect the results that we get. I hope you found this video helpful. If you need a refresher on other Tableau topics, please feel free to visit other videos in this channel. Again, thank you so much for your time, for your support, and I'll see you again next time.